Let's talk about threat modeling in this video. Before we talk about threat modeling, we need to discuss risk management a little bit. The goal of risk management is to reduce two major things. One, the probability of a compromise or a successful attack. And then once a compromise occurs, we also want to reduce its impact on assets. Then how do we do this? The means by which we can do this include: one, by removing, of course, vulnerabilities, or by implementing countermeasures. So basically, to remove the vulnerabilities, of course, countermeasures are critical. To remove vulnerabilities, we have to know what's really out there first, both in terms of tangible and intangible assets. So, tangible assets, I would say, is something you can see and touch. For example, a web server, a piece of hardware. We could say that it's tangible. However, the value of that asset, the web server, cannot be completely appreciated by the cost of the web server, the physical value, but it also has some intangible value associated with it. So for example, what if your website gets defaced? Then the reputation of your company goes down, which will have a big impact on probably your sales. So that's why you have to consider both tangible and intangible values of an asset whenever you consider an asset and its value. Once we know what's out there, what kind of assets we actually have, we also need to understand how valuable these assets are. So once we have these two pieces of information, then we can kind of see the significance of these activities. Asset enumeration, meaning identifying what's really out there in terms of assets and understanding their values, which is valuation. So why is it so significant in risk management? Because by knowing which is more valuable or less valuable, we understand how to prioritize in terms of our risk management. Another important aspect is, for example, it's very important to be able to tell whether an asset is worth protecting in risk management, because if you introduce a countermeasure that's going to be much more expensive to implement than the actual value of an asset, that's a waste of time and money. So asset enumeration and valuation provides a basis for this type of cost-benefit analysis. That's a critical part of your risk management. So what are the goals of threat modeling then? There could be some immediate goals and ultimate goals. So let's start with discussing these immediate goals first. I would say the first immediate goal is really to identify and analyze threats to assets. We want to do this in a very scientific and structured way, and which is why we're using a technique such as, for example, categorization sometimes. Another thing I would like to mention here is this immediate goal of threat modeling has something to do with the fact that threats are identified because we want to know how those are actually ultimately related to the assets, because the assets are what we're trying to really protect, and that is really the bottom line of our security and information assurance effort. So the ultimate goal of threat modeling is, first of all, to prioritize threats, right? Because there could be so many different threats out there, and we don't really have all the resources to address every single threat out there. So we have to really prioritize based on, for example, the probability. I mean, how probable it is for that threat to be materialized. And another thing to consider is how much impact it has on an asset, because if it has a very little impact on an asset, then again we may not want to consider that threat because it doesn't do anything. And if it doesn't happen at all, then we don't have to worry about that either, right? So prioritization is one of the ultimate goals. Another ultimate goal is to really help risk management, because this entire thing, I mean, asset valuation and enumeration, threat modeling, these are all part of actually risk management, because to reduce the probability of a compromise and to also reduce vulnerabilities, we can start by identifying, for example, assets being affected and also finding the vulnerabilities. How do we then approach threat modeling? I mean, how do we do the threat modeling exercise? We can reason about threats by focusing on, for example, assets. So once we think about what kind of assets we have and start reasoning about threats around those assets, that's a very good way to get started with threat modeling. So we can think about the threats, especially more valuable assets, because like we already discussed, relatively less valuable assets aren't really under our consideration. We only care about assets that are more valuable because of the limitations in our resources to address security. And then also, once we start thinking about threats to assets, we can now also identify vulnerabilities associated with these assets. And also, if you already have some sort of a countermeasure to protect the asset, then we can also think about the vulnerabilities in the countermeasures themselves. So that's one way of reasoning about threats. Another way is to focus on attackers. So when we start thinking about attackers, especially the threats posed by potential attackers, we can think about threats they can introduce, and especially we have to pay attention to the attacker's goals, because again, depending on their goals, some attacks could be more serious than the others. Another place to think about is the software you have, because software is probably the source of all the vulnerabilities. Not probably all, but most of the vulnerabilities out there anyway. And there are so many opportunities for a vulnerability to be introduced in the software. I mean, during the development process, while you're maintaining your software, while you're actually coding. I mean, there are so many chances. So this is another place to look at when you're thinking about threats, definitely. And you can of course come up with a lot of threats that way too.